Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome and happy holidays. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Spencer Ruchty. I'm the author events manager here in the back rooms of Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington, and on behalf of our store, as well as the Community Bookstore in Brooklyn and the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's conversation with translators Emma Ramadan and Olivia Baes, as well as poet, essayist, and critic Elisa Gabbert for conversation on Marguerite Duras and her novel, The Easy Life. First of all, I want to invite you all to use the chat at the bottom of your screen to say hello, and do let us know where you're calling in from. This is kind of a special event because it is our last event of the year with Community Bookstore in Brookline Booksmith. This is usually the space where I plug a few of our upcoming events, but the holiday season is fully upon us, and author readings are winding down for the year, so we can focus on getting the books that we've been advocating for all year into the hands of our customers, which means spending a lot of time off of Zoom and in front of our communities. The holidays are also a nice time to reflect a little bit. And it was actually, I was looking at our past event calendars today, and it was actually in September 2021 that Third Place first teamed up with Pierce Alquist and the Transnational Literature Series to co-host a virtual event with Mexican author Yuri Herrera and his translator Lisa Dillman, which was a pairing that I was super excited for and who I dearly love. And it was such a fulfilling experience that we have decided to do this once about every other month, if not every month, with translators within our community. So it was also exactly 1 year ago today, if you can believe it, that we had our first virtual reading with Community Bookstore for German Bosnian writer Sasha Stanisic in his novel Where You Come From with his translator Damien Searles. Our three bookstores finally came together in February of this year to host Olga Tokarczuk with her translator Jennifer Croft and Rabi Alameddine, which is one virtual experience that I will never forget, and I can't believe that was under a year ago. So this is a huge thank you to Noah at Community Bookstore and Pierce at Brookline Booksmith, and of course to so many of you who consistently come out to these events and support this series. We see a lot of regular names on our screens, and we have since the beginning. We see you, and there is no better feeling than to know that we're in this space with you supporting good literature. So thank you for coming. Please do keep on coming in the new year and continue to support booksellers that support the art of translation. As mentioned, the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and we do encourage you to use it tonight. During the last 15 minutes or so, we'll also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our translators this evening, please submit those to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning for any of you who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button to turn that feature on or off. A reminder that we are recording this event, so if you happen to miss anything, we'll be emailing a recording to everyone who registered. And of course, you can order The Easy Life, which I have here in manuscript form, from your neighborhood independent bookstore. If you're in Seattle, please do come stop by any one of our three locations in Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, or Seward Park. I'm at our Lake Forest Park store Mondays through Fridays. You are more than welcome to call me out by name. I'd love to talk to you. If you're in Brooklyn, get down to Community Bookstore and say hi to their garden turtle for me. And of course, if you are in Boston, you can take the Green Line to Brookline Booksmith in their beautiful store. Every purchase you make supports the future of our author series, so thank you. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Olivia Baes is a Franco-American multidisciplinary artist who grew up between France, Catalonia, and the United States. She holds a Master of the Arts in Cultural Translation from the American University of Paris. And in addition to Duras, her translations include Jean-Luc Persecuted by C.F. Ramuz, which was published by Deep Vellum in 2020. Emma Ramadan is a literary translator of poetry and prose from France, North Africa, and the Middle East. She is the recipient of a Fulbright, an NEA Translation Fellowship, the 2018 Albertine Prize, and the 2021 Penn Translation Prize. Her translations include In Concrete by Anne Goretta, A Country for Dying by Abdella Taya, and very recently Panics by Barbara Molinard, who is a protege and very close friend of Duras. Joining our translators in conversation tonight is Elisa Gabbert, the author of 6 collections of poetry, essays, and criticism, most recently the wonderful poetry collection Normal Distance, which was published by Soft Skull, and The Unreality of Memory and Other Essays, which was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and was read by many booksellers, including myself, during the pandemic. She is also the writer for the On Poetry column for the New York Times. Tonight, they'll be discussing a foundational masterpiece by Marguerite Duras, The Easy Life, which was translated into English by both Emma and Olivia. And this isn't the first time they've worked together to publish Duras. Their first collection, or the first, was actually a collection of essays called Me and Other Writing, which was published by Dorothy, a publishing project, in 2019. Marguerite Duras was one of France's most prolific and important writers. Born in 1914 in what was then French Indochina, she went to Paris in 1931 to study at the Sorbonne. And during World War II, she was active in the resistance. And in 1945, she joined the Communist Party. Duras is perhaps best known for the internationally best-selling novel The Lover, which won the Prix Goncourt in 1984. People do seem to pay attention whenever there's a new Duras translation on the table. Claire Massoud, in her books column in Harper's, writes that The Easy Life is, quote, at times amazingly good, always unflinching in its contemplation of life's great intensities. And she goes on to say that it carries the inexorable force of Greek tragedy. We are so thrilled to have these three artists with us tonight to talk about this new novel. Please join me in welcoming Emma, Olivia, and Elisa to your screen.
Hello. Thank you, Spencer. That was so wonderful. Thank you, Emma and Olivia, for inviting me to talk about this book with you. I perhaps obviously had never read it before. I don't read French. And this, of course, is the first time it's been translated into English. And I had the experience of immediately wanting to talk to people about it. So there's nobody else I can talk to about it but you until, hopefully after tonight, many other people. But I found it just so fascinating and mysterious and strange in the way that Duras is so uniquely strange. And we'll, I think, get to that a little bit later. But I wanted to start with just a little bit of an introduction from you in terms of how did this book come about? Like, how did you discover this book? How did you come together as translators? What made you want to translate it? All of that.
You want to start?
Okay. Well, we met in our Masters for Cultural Translation, and we immediately sort of were drawn to each other for many different reasons. But I think one of the main things that formed our bond was our kind of obsession for Marguerite Duras. And as the year sort of went on and we were with separate authors, we said, let's maybe try to translate some untranslated Duras together. And so Emma had sort of had this on her radar, and she knew that there were a couple books that had not been translated. So, yeah.
And we started with L'été 80 or Summer 80, which was in the previous translation we did with Dorothy. And I knew that there was this other novel that hadn't been translated yet. And sort of as soon as we finished that, we knew we were going to start working on this one and pitching this one. And yeah, I mean, I think we'd also translated a little bit together as part of our masters, and we just have very similar taste in literature and very similar taste or very similar philosophies around translation and like the kind of intricacies of rhythm and translation, which comes up a lot with Duras. And so we felt a kinship there from the beginning.
What is your philosophy of translation? I have to know. And I should say, I have not read the translator's note because my advanced copy didn't have it in there yet. And I'm saving it. I always save front and end matter till the very end because I find it so delicious. I've always wanted to edit an anthology of translators' notes and introductions and things like that. So I'm saving it. But and I also wanted it to be fresh. I wanted to know without knowing before this conversation.
Well, I think we, like Emma just touched on, I think we both place so much importance on rhythm, and the fact that we're both, we write poetry, we're very much lovers of poetry. And when we were in our masters, we sort of came upon this theory of rhythm, which I'm not going to go into, but which said that meaning was found in rhythm and not in the sign and not in words. And I think both of the authors that we are very interested in seem to have rhythm as what conveys meaning more than the word. And I think with Duras, we can really say that. And so for us, it's always been a bit, I think our theory of translation is a little bit almost mystical, because it's like, how do you catch that rhythm instead of like have all your dictionaries there and have something that's much more practical and sort of, no, we're really interested in sort of drifting into Duras and finding her in a way that as if we were writing it, it's like, it's something we talk about a lot, is like, how do we let go so that we kind of enter that rhythm and we find the meaning through the rhythm.
And one of the pieces, the nonfiction pieces that we translated as part of Me and Other Writing is called Translation. And it's literally Duras writing about what she thinks a good translation is. And like, how horrifying would it have been if we read this piece and it was like not at all how we were translating her.
Yeah.
But she talks in that piece about how you can't translate a text without translating its music, essentially, and how like the music of a text is in itself the meaning. And especially in her books, and like you as a poet, Elisa, probably also feel this very strongly, but in her books, there's sort of like an undeniable sense of rhythm that feels like sometimes you're reading her sentences and you don't actually really understand what they mean, but you're swept up in them, and that is the meaning. And there's like this sense of she is creating her stories and the emotions of her characters directly out of the rhythm of her sentences, as opposed to necessarily like factual information being conveyed. And so how you convey that in translation is a whole other thing, but the fact that we're both aligned on that being a priority for us, especially with an author like Duras, feels very at the forefront.
I'm so glad you're talking about the poetry of her prose, because although I write poetry and prose, I am always kind of suspicious when prose is described as poetic, because I mean, people use that to mean different things. And I feel like often it actually just sort of means like, oh, it's really overwritten, or there's like too many metaphors or something. But reading this, I was like, okay, this is what poetic prose is. And it is that like the meaning is so sound-based, and it's so like elusively and hypnotically beautiful and mysterious that it's almost like just incantatory, like religious, right? And yeah, I have, I guess, two follow-up questions around this. One, like, did you have arguments ever in those passages about like how to achieve that, since you are like fundamentally changing the rhythm, of course, when you go to a different language, though, perhaps less so between two semi-related languages like English and French, and they're not really that related, but closer than say like Chinese to English, in terms of sentence structure and vocabulary. And then my follow-up question to that is like, would you read a little passage that you like either especially kind of labored over, or that you think especially illustrates this poetic quality in the prose?
So even though we have like many things in common, we obviously also have our differences. I think maybe the main one is that my native language is French, even though I'm a native bilingual, but my mother tongue is French. And so there are moments where I tend to want to really adhere to the French rhythm, what I consider being a French rhythm, and to try to kind of push that onto the English. And there are moments where Emma just goes, no, that's not really, like, we need to work on that a little bit. So one example is when Duras does lists, she often lists things and goes off in this kind of endless list, which of course is part of the rhythm. And for me, when we started co-translating her, I always wanted to keep the articles like of this, of that, of this, with every comma break. And Emma was like, had to be like, no, but wait, like that of is really distracting. Like maybe we should kind of get rid of it. And it's actually it's actually the rhythm is getting lost when we're doing that, when we're keeping that syllable. So there's moments where we argue about things like that, for example. And then I would say we argue, sometimes I push to keep things very strange and very elusive, like you were saying, and Emma's really good at being like, wait, but are you sure we know exactly what's going on here. And the point, and I think we've realized we don't really always know what's going on, but that sometimes we have to trust what's elusive and strange, and we have to just kind of give into it. So we push and pull more than argue. It's like we push and pull and sort of get somewhere that feels like it's Duras, I think.
Yeah, and I'm gonna let you keep looking for the river passage. I can't find it.
Oh, the river passage.
But
Okay.
I'm around it. You'll find
Okay.
it now. Yeah, I mean, we both laughed when you said, did you argue? Because like so much of this was us over FaceTime arguing. I feel like we've become sisters at this point because we, like sisters do, we bickered and then like there's so much trust and love there that it becomes it's like more of a compromise. It like sometimes literally it was like, okay, you really want to keep in those articles that I don't think sound very good, then like, fine, you get to keep the articles there. But then in this passage, we're doing what I wanted to do. And there's like this, like rhythm, like you said, it does change when you bring it into another language. And so it's about how do you keep Duras, which is a phrase that came up for us yesterday, but how do you like understand that English, like people will read it in a certain way while also trying to push English to be something new to accommodate what she's doing, and finding that kind of in between space where she is still existing as she should be heard, but in English she will also still sound flowy and good and natural. It's a tough thing, but there was a lot of like reading out loud to each other, and having a co-translator is so vital in those moments where you can both like be reading and listening together for a rhythm that you're sort of like just trying to like feel it more than you are trying to write it.
Absolutely.
I don't know if any of that made sense.
Yes, so I have like dabbled in the most dabbly way with translation, always of poetry. And my inclination was always to be like as literal as possible. And it's been from French, by the way, because I took some French in high school. I'm not bilingual by any stretch. But yeah, my impulse was always to kind of preserve whatever weirdness or awkwardness was in the original language, like, and just do it literally. Like I would totally leave all the ofs in. That's totally how I would do it. And then you would have to be like, no. Did you find the passage you were looking for?
Yeah.
Before I talk over you for too long.
So do you want to, I'll give context and then Olivia will read. What is
I have it. It's
okay. So it's when in part 1, so the book is broken into 3 parts. The first part is, well, did we talk about the narrator yet? I don't know. Did Spencer say it in his introduction? Okay. So, or not the narrator, but the main character, our protagonist of sorts, Francine, who lives on her family's farm in a fictional town called Les Bougues. And basically the family farm, the area where the farm is just incredibly boring. And it's so boring that Francine kind of craves a certain kind of chaos, and she sets the wheels in motion for a series of chaotic events. And the first part of the book is her and her family kind of like stuck in this very almost like suffocating weird environment on the family farm in this town. And then the second part, she kind of breaks away from this farm. She goes to the coast, to another fictional town, and kind of both loses and finds herself there in like all sorts of interesting and experimental ways. And then in the third part, she returns. And so Olivia is going to read from a section in the first part where she and her family and also her like love interest Tien are all having a picnic by the river. And this is like, Nicholas's little party. And this is what we think is a really nice example of like very rhythmic, but maybe nonsensical, but like sensical in its rhythm prose.
okay. So I start here now.
Sure.
Once I was in the water. I got into the water too. I thought I'd go up the Rissal until I found them. But once I was in the water, I chose to go down the river instead of joining them. I was not a very good swimmer, and I found it easier to go with the current than against it. The water was cold. I soon felt as fresh, as alive as it was. I started to swim with an unfamiliar ease. Without knowing it, I had probably been waiting for a long time to go down the stream of the Rissal on a beautiful afternoon. Tien wasn't there. He had gone the other way, but it was as if I was swimming toward him, though I knew he could not be in this direction. I would glimpse him on the bank. He would say, "You're so beautiful when you swim." After a while, I didn't know if I was dreaming. It was as though I had been lulled to sleep by my steady swim. I no longer dared to look above the water, as if my wanting to catch him there, watching me, was going to drive him away. The current was strong, and it overtook me. I had no trouble swimming. The sun was high, and the surface of the river burst into yellow and blue mirrors before my eyes. Without trying to see them, through the wickers I glimpsed the still shadows of cows moving slowly through the valley. I passed 2 small children who were fishing. I was probably the one who had warmed up the water. It became softer and softer to sink into, more and more familiar. In the end, I struggled to breathe and felt the desire to stop swimming. I got out of the water. I no longer expected to see Tien. I knew that I was alone.
Yeah.
Is that what?
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is where we had an argument.
We had
too.
talked about the mirrors. As you were reading that, I remember we had an
Right.
argument.
Well, because it's funny, there's this expression in French that I love so much, called "à fleur de," and it's basically just
Right. I remember it's all coming, the trauma is coming back to
yeah.
me.
And here we have it as before my eyes, like the yellow and blue mirrors before my eyes. But there's something so beautiful in French that's not getting quite translated, because it's like I wanted it to be like before the petals of my eyes or something, because à fleur is flower, and so it's like the flower, it's like right in the flower of your eyes, and they use it to say, when you're very sensitive, you can say à fleur de peau. It's like as if your skin is a flower, thin-skinned. So anyway, this was a thing that I just thought, I know Duras is maybe not using it exactly, because your eyes are like petals, but it was sort of this thing where I was like, oh, I wish there was something else. And she was like, I don't think so.
Because I think Olivia had sent, because we split it up sections and then edited each other's sections, and then we argued forever about them. And I think Olivia had sent me her translation, and it said the petals of your eyes. And I was like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. And then we had this whole back and forth, and it's yes, that's so beautiful in French, but if you put that in English, you lose the whole image, you lose something really beautiful. And yeah, but I remember that argument fondly now.
This is so fascinating to me. And I'm so torn between there's so many translation questions I want to ask you, and also so many questions I want to ask you about the novel. So just try to remind me to come back to the strangeness and clarity question, because I feel there's a lot to say around that. Do we know what's happening here or not? But I have one more translation question, I think, before I move on to that, which is, how did you decide to translate the title the way you did? Because I know in French it's La Vie Tranquille, right? And so the literal translation, maybe the easiest one to reach for would be the tranquil life, or maybe the quiet life. And so the easy life feels like a very interesting choice. So I wonder if this was another argument, or if you knew right away.
I don't think this was really an argument. We never wanted to do the tranquil life, because I think that sounds dumb. But
I think it sounds very forced, and that was sort of my feeling, is in French, there's an ease with La Vie Tranquille. You really feel like it rolls off the tongue. There's nothing, actually there's nothing strange about that title. It's very normal. It's very normal, colloquial. And so I feel
yeah, I wonder if it's an idiom in French, because of course the easy life is an idiom in English. And
you can say to some, also tranquille, the way you use it is for example, if someone's freaking out, you're tranquille, people kind of calm down. It's sort of relax. Yeah, exactly. So,
but there was a point when the translation of the title was going to be The Quiet Life.
Oh, true.
Yeah,
I forgot about
that. But then I remember there was a day when I sent Olivia a flurry of WhatsApp messages, and I was like, it has to be the easy life. I've decided it has to be the easy life, because like the quiet life, I think, doesn't quite actually convey what happens in this book, which is when the phrase comes up in the book, when she returns to Les Bougs and she's sort of decided on a certain kind of life. And what that actually means is kind of maybe up for debate, but quiet is not it. I mean, this girl is not someone who can live a quiet life. And like, she has to set a series of crimes in motion to like deal with her family farm. Like, she can't live a quiet life, but her version of like easy has more ambiguity to it. It's more open to interpretation. What someone defines as the easy life versus what someone else defines as the easy life feels more nebulous, whereas like a quiet life, it's not really up for interpretation. It's like a calm, mellow existence. And I don't necessarily think the easy life has to be that. Like, everyone's version of easy is different. Also, I just think it's like a very nice title. I really like the title, like the easy life, you know, it's
I love that justification, because I was sort of questioning it up until I got to like the later parts of the novel and like that long section in italics, which people who know me well would know that I'm like my least favorite thing in a book is the long section in italics. But I mean, luckily it's not that long in this book.
We were talking about that yesterday. We were like, we're still not quite sure
We have
why
no idea
it's in
why.
italics.
Yeah, I have no idea either. It's so, and the transition out with like no break that's fascinating. Like, so I feel like just the transition almost justifies the italics.
It was funny. I was wondering whether last night when we were talking about it, I started wondering, because it feels like an inner monologue or a diary to me, that part. And so I almost wondered whether Gallimard in that time maybe decided to put it in italics to sort of keep it less strained, you know, to sort of denote that this was like an inner, I don't know. And I'm not sure they could have ever done that.
I don't think it was Gallimard. I think it was Minuit.
Wasn't it Gallimard? Oh no, it was Minuit.
Yeah.
Are you sure it was not Gallimard?
I'm not sure.
I
But
think,
yeah,
okay.
I think
Well, whoever
Olivia,
that was.
Olivia's reasoning tracks for me, but it was like puzzling.
Yeah.
Why is this italics? Like, for
yeah, in any case though, when I got to that part and she says that phrase several times, it's like, it suddenly makes your choice makes total sense to me, basically. But I feel like you could only question it if you haven't finished the book,
right?
Because it's like there's a lot of canards, I guess, where it seems like it might apply to something else or something earlier or some other period of the book, and you really have to finish it to understand all those other connotations.
Yeah.
But I mean, I feel like this translates really nicely into my questions about like a little bit more about the content of the novel, and I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, but I think this must have been a difficult and interesting book to translate when it came to questions of like, is this clear enough? Because I just don't think Duras is very clear, like at like the heart of her, you know, like I don't believe that there's a clear version. And I really enjoyed that little tidbit in Kate's introduction where she said that Crenot thought the novel was like muddled and uncontrolled, but also so like beautiful and great that he wanted to publish it anyway. And that's how I felt about it. Like there's just this sort of fundamental lack of clarity. It's not realist. And like, I don't think you could create, say, like a timeline, like an accurate timeline of these are the events and when they happened. I think that would be impossible because the time doesn't make sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's parts where like, it seems like there's been many, many months of events. And then she'll say, that was 3 weeks ago. Or like, it was still September. Like so much happens in September. It's completely impossible. There's no way all that stuff happened in September. So I just wonder if we could talk a little bit about this, like the weirdness.
I feel like it's very interesting because of that, because they're so subjective. Like this character, it's definitely the way we're experiencing time, grief, this kind of dissociation that she starts to experience when she gets to tea in the second part, as Emma mentioned. And there's this, I don't know, I sort of feel like the book is like inside out, like we're really living the world through her. And I love that. Like personally, that's what touched me so much about this book when I first read it. I remember Emma and I texting and obsessing over the same passages where she starts to she comes face to face with herself, and time really starts getting very weird. And so, yeah, I think there's so many moments where her perspective of the world just muddles, like, to use the editor's word, but just kind of makes things foggy, and we don't really know where we are, when it is. But I think if you just follow her and you just kind of go with it, which is what we almost have to do as translators too, but if you as a reader do that, the clarity comes to you in the flow, like while you're reading it, sort of.
Yeah, but and there is this like tricky thing, because when you're a writer and when you're a reader, you don't necessarily need to know what's happening to feel it. But as a translator, you kind of need to know what's happening to translate it. And so Olivia and I would like have these moments where we would be on FaceTime, like, what is going on in this scene? And because as a reader, when we read the book in French, we like, it didn't bother us at all that we didn't really understand the specific concrete details, because as you say, like, Duras is intentionally not clear. Like, it's part of her style is that she gets into this flow. Her writing was always described as the écriture courante, like the current writing. And that's like her shtick, right? That like, it doesn't always make sense because it's felt writing. It's not thought writing. But when you're translating her, you have to be able to rewrite something in another language. And so you have to be able to pinpoint what's actually happening here so that I can put it in English. And there's something sort of like sad about having to pinpoint someone who is purposely not wanting to be pinpointed. And in certain ways, like, we have to pick a version of what is happening. And like, yes, we tried to leave things vague in certain senses, but then in other senses, like, the act of having to write a sentence when you don't understand what's going on in the sentence, and not because you don't speak French well enough, or not because you don't like, you're not smart enough, but because it's not meant to be understood in that way that we typically think we're supposed to understand sentences, was the hardest part of this book and of like any translation I've ever done. That like, she's trying to evoke a feeling, not a thought. And so we had to like think about how to write that feeling. I'm just rambling now, so I'll stop.
But it's funny. I do feel like it's one of those, or it's kind of in a way funny that our favorite passages were like maybe our least favorite to translate, because they were like the hardest.
Oh, I love that.
So as a reader, you're, like you said, it's so enjoyable because you just are rushing with it, with that current. And then with a translator, kind of have to stop. You're not able to really just flow with it. Although I would say that part of how we finally were able to do is that sometimes we did have to just let go. And that's what I like to do. And sometimes it's good. That's where we push and pull a little. And I think it's good because I tend to just think it's okay if we don't understand. Let's just, let's go with it. And then we start talking and we're like, wait, but do we really understand this? And sometimes we get to a point where we're like, okay, maybe we don't, but if we reread this passage and we get to that part, do we, like you said, is the feeling there? Do we feel what we did when we read the original? So sometimes it's really, I don't want to say guesswork, it's not, but it's like something of catching a flow, catching a feeling. It's something like last night we taught, Stephanie Lacava was talking about translating being a little bit like acting, and I'm not going to get into it, but I think there is something of, you don't exactly understand what you're doing, but you're having to live the text in the present moment and just kind of reenact it, So I think we have to do a bit of that.
Yeah. I'd say that's right. And that, and like sometimes we would even have like, we'd be on like our third draft, and then suddenly I would be like, wait, this actually doesn't make any sense. And then we would be like, oh shit, you're right. And it was like this, but like we had read the passage so many times that like for us, it didn't stand out, but so
it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, there's this like very useful lack of clarity in terms of like just the ambiguity of the situation or like the psychological ambiguity, because to me, and again, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, but as you say, like there's the sense in which she kind of sets off this series of events that she's not like directly responsible for exactly, but
Right.
The very first like paragraph, perhaps sentence, is like she sort of instigates a fight between her brother and her uncle ends up dying. So that's not a spoiler. That happens really early on. And then like events, ensue from there. But the fact that she, like later she admits that she wanted her uncle to die,
Wow.
that changes the whole psychological texture of the book, because there's this question of like is her responsibility in her mind or was it in the world? Like, there's a read where you can like see that she's evil and like she's somehow just like a sorceress brought this all about just through her desire, and like there's kind of a happy ending. And so like that that read is kind of supported by the fact that like she gets everything she wants in the end, sort of. Or you can read it as like, no, she's just going completely mad with grief. And, I think Freud says that like one of the like features of madness is that you attribute things that have nothing to do with you in the world to like your own mind control. And so there's this like Freudian read that she's just like believes it's all her fault, but it's actually not at all. And I love that it's not like, I don't think it's fully resolved. I only read this book once, and I don't know if I read it multiple times, I would feel like it is resolved in the text, but like I want that essential degree of mystery in the text so that it isn't resolved. So I'm just, I don't know if you want to talk at all about like, is it difficult to translate ambiguity?
Yeah, though I think like what was really helpful, there were like layers of the text that Olivia and I had different interpretations of. Specifically like the love story and like the ending. Olivia and I kind of disagreed and may still disagree on the importance of Tien, the love interest, and like what his role is and what the easy life means or is. But I think in terms of everything else, we were pretty aligned, and that made it easier to translate together because the text is ambiguous, but our shared like psychic understanding of what was happening with Francine and her psychology, we were like pretty aligned. And so that helped guide us. And like when we weren't totally sure what a specific passage meant, we could like channel, well, this is who we know her to be. And so from there, let's backtrack maybe what she would be doing in this moment. So I think like if we both had very different interpretations of her character or the text, that would have made translating the ambiguity an impossible task.
Definitely, I agree. I think early on we had a lot of conversations about her because we both liked her, despite what you said, that read where she could be this kind of evil.
No, I like her too.
It's funny because I said this yesterday, but I sort of feel like there's this thing too, where now I was starting to think of her as she's almost like a writer, this character, because she's like orchestrating everything that's happening around her and people are like her pawns, and so there's this kind of, because Duras is finding her voice with this novel, I started thinking, wow, it's almost like Francine with this, what you're saying, this kind of Machiavellic thing of how she's causing things to happen. In a way, it's like she's writing. I don't know, that's what writers do. And so we felt close to her, I think, for many reasons. And also having been that age where you don't really know what you're capable of. I mean, obviously it's a very extreme story, like extreme chaotic events occur, but I think it's sort of, we sympathized for her a little bit from the start and felt close to her different realizations. I think especially in the second part. And so I think that really kept us aligned, like you said.
Yeah, I think what resonated so much for us about this book was the second part. And I feel like you're avoiding talking about it because you see it as a spoiler. But if I may spoil like one thing, when she goes to the seaside, she has like a full breakdown and literally sees the different versions of herself that she could be, or maybe is, or wants to be, or was. And this is also where the timeline kind of gets skewed, because she talks about how we are everyone we have ever been in succession, and that we like pile up these versions of ourselves within ourselves. But then she sort of is like forced to look at all these versions of herself and choose one to go home with. And I think like she's having a quarter life crisis. She's like a 24-year-old sociopath, who's like truly, who is like
we like her though, it's fine.
But we don't have sympathy for her sociopathic tendencies, but we like, I think, really relate to this idea that like life for her, it feels like life is kind of slipping through her fingers, and she's so desperately trying to figure out how to grab hold of it, but just like, how do I exert my presence on this world? Like, how do I feel alive? How do I feel like a person that has power and value? And all of her ways of doing it are like maybe not quite what we would do or healthy or right. But like there is this like deep desperation of, I just want to feel like me, and I just want to feel like I'm living life. And that is like, I think everyone can relate to that feeling. And it's something like Olivia and I have been like we've known each other since we were in our early 20s. And this kind of thing has like, all the different versions of yourself you could have been or could still be, it feels like very relevant to us. And I think like was what drew us to the book in the first place.
Yeah. And I mean, I love the writer interpretation, but yeah, it's almost like you could read it as like a delusion of agency, right? Like a feminist read, because I mean, like we still have that, but I mean, of course it was even more oppressive at that time. Hi Spencer, welcome back.
Hey, how's it going? Well, this conversation has been really wonderful. Thank you so much, the three of you, for first of all doing this and taking time out of your Wednesday night to talk about this book. We are now at the audience Q&A portion of our evening. So if you have questions for any of our authors or translators this evening, we do have a Q&A window at the bottom of the screen, or you can throw those in the chat. Either way, I will read them and catch them. And so as we're waiting for those to come in, I did have one question I'd like to start us off with, which is, I imagine when you have two translators working on the same text, that there's probably a lot of like, conflict, whether major or minor, about, I mean, when you're trying to render every single word in a text. I mean, there are a lot of options. There are a lot of choices, and stylistically, I imagine you two, there are different approaches to every word that you translate. So I'm curious how you overcame those conflicts or major decisions together when it came to translating.
You go ahead.
We would have meetings about, we commented passively aggressively on each other's drafts.
I hope you would say that for some reason.
We have really great screenshots of those over the last 5 years or so. And then as we go through the draft together on FaceTime, that's when we really start to debate.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like kind of laughing because I'm thinking about some of those screenshots. I don't know if this is from this translation or the last one, but there were also a lot of like, what the hell does this mean? And then Olivia just responding, IDK. over and over. No, but yeah, I think like I think this wouldn't work. Okay, we're both so insanely obsessed with Duras and with her writing and with translation that like this wouldn't work, and we wouldn't be able to resolve conflict if we didn't trust each other and like love each other as writers and translators, like have so much respect for each other, is I think what I'm reaching for. Like I think Olivia is the most brilliant writer and like thinker I've ever encountered in my entire life. And so
now it sounds like a lie.
No, I like say this all the time, that like I think you're so brilliant, and I learned so much from translating with you and from working with you. And I think like if I didn't have that respect for Olivia, the like little bickerings, I'd feel like less open to her interpretations, or I would feel like more committed to it being my way. And like I feel such a personal attachment to Duras, but like I don't feel like I actually wish that I had translated this book alone, because I feel like I learned so much from translating with Olivia, and the translation is better for us both being involved. And so I think like that respect component and that trust component, and also just like being able to bicker and bounce back, and being able to say like, I'm going to give you this one, but I'm going to take this one, was like
interesting.
Yeah.
No, we definitely filter each other, I think, in the right ways. And it really, I agree 100% with Emma. I think our respect and trust, the fact that we studied at the same MA program, so we actually, you know, in a way, our minds are very aligned with how we think about translation. And like you said, our obsession for Duras, I think there is that feeling of, I'm so glad I did it with you. And for me, Emma, I said this before when we were interviewed, but she's always with me now when I translate. Like, she is my filter with everything now, because I really feel like she brings a lot to this. I mean, what you said, like, you bring so much to the table for me. And so I really feel like I've sort of internalized a lot of it now.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So
I mean, to have that internal editor, wow, that's really fascinating. Do you feel like the process for this book changed compared to like the process of translating Duras's fiction changed as opposed to her nonfiction?
We were talking about this recently, that her nonfiction is so full of her. Like, so, I mean, it's the collection of her nonfiction is called Me and Other Writing, because her writing, even her nonfiction, is very subjective, and it's very Duras, and it's not like objective, here's this thing that I'm writing about. It's very much like, you think I'm going to be writing about this historical event, but really I'm writing about myself. And so in a certain way, it's not that different. I think like the rhythm of the fiction is more all-encompassing and more powerful. And we respect like the rhythm, or like bow down to the rhythm in a certain way, more with her fiction than with her nonfiction. But even with her nonfiction, it's still kind of there.
I think maybe this was slightly easier just because we had already done it also once before. So it's kind of a feeling of, oh, well, we had that experience of co-translating her. We already sort of, I mean, in a way, we already had to do the work of catching her flow, finding her voice. And so there was sort of, okay, now we're going into another project. You know, it made it a little easier. Even we knew each other and what we were going to be arguing about sort of beforehand. So like I said, if you have that internal editor already, maybe you have less disagreements, you know?
Like one of Olivia's drafts, and it would be like, do not argue with me on this. I'm really like insistent on this, even before I had seen it. You know, I would like, it would like arrive in my inbox with her being like, you're going to argue with me on this, and don't even try.
Okay, well, enough of my questions. We do have questions from the audience. We have one attendee who says, and I think you talked about the title of the book and the decision that went into translating the title, The Easy Life, a little bit earlier. But this attendee says, I wonder why the publisher had decided to translate the title of the book as The Easy Life and not The Tranquil Life or The Quiet Life. Easy or facile in French has such a different meaning, and this person read the book a while back in French.
Yeah, we talked.
Let's see, what was the original title?
La vie tranquille.
Tranquille. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
I don't know. We did talk about this. Do you want us to answer? Okay.
Yeah, go. Yeah, maybe just talk a little. Yeah.
I mean, I think that if you think about easy, I know that its direct translation would be facile, but again, as I think we said it so many times, but I think there's something about the rhythm of her text that's almost more kind of what you're catching of her text that might not be directly in like, oh, you open the dictionary and easy is facile. Like, I think that easy catches something of tranquille that for me, tranquil in English doesn't. Like, I've never heard someone be like, oh, you know, I'm looking for the tranquil life. Like, it doesn't flow. Doesn't catch it, you know? So I think apart from all our other reasons, for me, if you want to look at like the definition, I think that's not our end all with Duras. If it was, I think we'd be making a mistake with this author, you know? So that's my answer, I think.
We can, I'm fine with that.
I think that's a great answer. And we have, let's see, Cindy Van says, I've heard that many translators state it is an underappreciated task. Do you feel that way, or is it changing as foreign authors seem to be more popular in the West? I guess also the question is, are foreign authors becoming more popular in the West?
I mean, like translators are like incredibly underpaid for the amount of work that goes into it and the artistry into it. It's not even a question. Of course, it's an underappreciated, underpaid, etc. art. I do think like the tides are slowly starting to shift and not quickly enough. And I don't know that they will ever shift quite enough for the profession to be, to pay translators what is worth, what the labor is worth and what the artistry is worth. But what we're seeing now these days in the last like 5 years that we weren't seeing before, I think is two things. One, a celebration of translators as individuals. So like a lot more translators' essays or translators' notes being published in their own right and things like that. Like we're no longer hiding in the shadows, pretending we don't exist. It's not seamless, is not like the adjective we're aiming for anymore. It's no, like I'm a human being. I have thoughts and opinions and philosophies about translation that are going to come through in the text. Also, like the books that I've read and the texts that I've studied and the things that I ate today, like all of those things are going to impact how I translate this text, and they should. And that's like what makes translation and translators interesting, and in the same way that writers are not machines. And the other thing that I think is happening too is more of an acceptance of translations that preserve some kind of weirdness or strain. I mean, I'm saying weirdness as if there's like a normal, but that don't have to fall in with regular English syntax or what English literature already looks like, and instead translations that can push English to be something different, instead of smoothing over or domesticating a text. And like we're seeing retranslations of texts that have been, that like back in the 80s, there was a different philosophy around translation, and all the things that were interesting about an author got completely erased, like Clarice Lispector, or maybe you can talk more about your experience with that. But I think like we're seeing kind of a tide shift in that way. I don't think that like the labor practices are quite catching up, but yeah.
No, I think it's definitely undervalued. And I think we sort of touched on this last night at our other launch. It's sort of, a translator sort of touches the bottom of the text, so to speak. Like we talked about how there's no one who really gets closer to the text except for the author. And that in itself is, how do you really do that? There is no really technique to do that. So I think that is sort of priceless, that getting so close to the text and getting in that invisible layer of the text, I think Duras calls it. So I think, absolutely. I think unfortunately a lot of people just assume that it's a bit robotic. Like, I don't know, maybe obviously not everyone, but I think even last night people came up to us and they were like, wow, we didn't realize how much like actually went into this, and it's like every sentence of the book we could be like, oh, well, here, this,
translators more than even editors or copy editors are doing this kind of artful work. I mean, editing and copy editing are both arts in themselves, but they are also not robotic tasks. I mean, it takes a lot of it's so much critical thinking, and it's so much did I have pizza today? Did I have I think that's a common phrase for like lit mag editors, like good pizza days. It's like, oh, I'm more likely to take this piece if I had a slice of pizza earlier because I'm in a good mood. I was curious, Elisa, do you notice kind of like this change in translated poetry? Like, is there kind of more attention to translators when it comes to poetry and the poetry world?
Think so. No, I think I mean there are a few sort of like well-known translators in the poetry world, but I think the bulk of the attention does go to the author, and and there's always the same kind of like fruitful but inane arguments over like, can you even translate poetry? It's like, of course you can.
I love those.
Yeah.
And then we have one final question before we head out tonight. And we have an attendee who says, I'm curious about how you divide your time between projects. I assume that each of you had simultaneously translation projects while you were co-translating this novel. So how did you manage that work?
I'm trying to think if I did.
I don't think I did.
Because we translated this during like the early pandemic days. So this may have been my focus, but it's also like, I think we did it in stages, because when you're working together with someone, you have to be flexible with your schedule. So I think I like to, if I'm working on other things, like I can't do two things at once. I have to like be really in one text and then be really in the next text. But with this, we like have to work around each other's schedules too. So it didn't always go that way. But
for me, I wasn't working on another translation, but I was working on my screenplay, because I'm developing my first film. And
really?
And it really, I did both simultaneously, and actually just really affects my work. Like whatever I'm translating seeps into everything else.
I'm sure.
So that I will say, it's very infectious, and like Duras is very invasive as a species of text, I would say. So we talk about that too. Like if we do any writing during our translation, innovatively.
It sounds like Duras.
Yeah, it sounds like Duras. So.
But also after I spend like so much time FaceTiming with Olivia, I start to talk like Olivia.
Yeah, we start to talk like each other. So other weird stuff happens.
That's very funny. Well, that's all the time we have for this evening. Do any of you have any last thoughts before we head out?
No, just so grateful for this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you, everyone hosting, and Elisa, thank you so much.
Oh, I loved it. I could have talked about these translation questions for another hour at least. But I hope people will read this book and then talk to me about it. It's
of course.
So wonderful.
The Easy Life is available in paperback at bookstores everywhere. Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you so much, Emma and Olivia, for bringing this into the world. We thank you also to, of course, Community Bookstore, the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith. Go visit your local bookstore this holiday season. Go buy hundreds of dollars worth of books. It keeps us in business. It keeps us going. Get all your friends weird little French books. They will love it. Other than that, on behalf of Third Place Books here in Seattle, have a great evening, everyone, and please